mention the point too about graduation and the distinction between the developing country status. And I think also you raised a few enabling clause issues, but maybe that's going too far into the weeds. We've done whole discussions on this too through some of the WITA seminars, so if folks are interested in more detail, we can also provide some of that. But thank you for that. That's really really important, and we can go back to the panel. Was there, I think I saw another hand or two. Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Kathy Jones. I'm from the Congressional Research Service, and I was wondering about the WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement and how that would, how we could leverage that with developing countries to deal with some of the problems.
Excellent. Maybe we could take one more question. Yes.
I'm Lena Khan with the Department of Labor, and I just wanted to hear a little bit more about the labor rights criteria under the new GSP assessment process and how that might be impacting the least developed countries perhaps differently than just the developed countries, and also be interested in hearing about the example from Bolivia and how that the child labor issue may have been addressed under the new criteria and whether that had a positive impact. But I would be interested in sort of hearing about the differences, particularly in countries that have less mature freedom of association environment, and are all countries essentially looked at the same way under this criteria, or are there sort of a more fluid way of sort of assessing countries, given that they may be at various stages of development in their rule of law and freedom of association in particular.
Okay, thank you very, very much. Nicole, we'll turn to you first for the next batch, if that's okay. Okay, so I will turn to all of you. I don't know where the microphone has gone. Would anyone like to start? And again, please respond. You don't have to respond to all of the questions and comments, just respond to those that you think are most related to what you've said in your comments.
I'll make a couple comments and then pass the mic down for, I think just to the point about helping countries comply, and then I think, you made the point about accessing markets. I think in general, as a country, we really undervalue the importance of development assistance, and obviously trade capacity building is just a tiny, tiny part of that. But it's just money so well spent. And I also personally would advocate reallocating some of the aid money that we have into some of these areas, because I think we have these terrific programs, but as you said, if countries don't know how or can't, just don't have the wherewithal to access it, it really completely defeats the process. The point of it. In terms of the trade facilitation agreement, I think that really is a really good, terrific step, and I think it will help a lot of countries. I think for some of the countries, though, they will also need the financial backup to that. For a lot of these countries, even just basic things like having the right kind of courts, having the legal infrastructure to enforce contracts, to enforce IPR, customs training, standards training. These things are just sort of very, very base level kinds of basics that we take for granted, that a lot of these countries just don't have in place and need to really be able to use and access the system. And we just need to do, I think, a much better job of that. And I think it's money that will, and investment that will redound to us, overall in terms of export markets, imports, and national security, and U.S. leadership many times over.
Thanks, Reed. Steve, comments?
Let me just make three very quick comments. Number one, of course, you're correct. There are various criteria in our various rules tied to per capita income, etc., for characterizing countries. The point I was making, however, that there are, I believe, agreements in the WTO which don't use these criteria but use others in order to provide some forms of special treatment for some countries. And that's what I was using about a possible way to move in defining this particular issue and so on. I think the point that Mr. Anthony made is excellent about the fact that benefits from the fact that China is now subject to higher duties have been largely limited to regional neighbors, Vietnam, Bangladesh, and of course the countries he mentioned. Now, one of the ideas that we've been trying to light a fire on without any success yet, but maybe we'll get it lit here in some way, is to say, listen, you have very tough origin rules within the GSP program and so on, particularly the value-added requirements and so on. The problem you're facing is that African countries could perhaps do a lot of processing of Chinese components if you had more liberal origin rules, which would be beneficial for Africa and beneficial for the US as it tries to end, quote, the disproportionate amount of manufacturing done in China and done in the Far East. So one of the issues that we have been suggesting we consider, rather in the context of AGOA, whether in the context of consultations with the African Union in the future, is maybe a more liberal origin rule, particularly if you have the opportunity to promote manufacturing that's moving out of China, and particularly if it fits into what Mr. Anthony describes as co-production with the US. We could have some particular advantages on that, so we did emphasize that one. And then a quick comment to the point that Katrin made. Let me tell you, Katrin, we're going to name 37 roads in Africa after Katrin, because no one has worked more in terms of ending the infrastructure bottleneck through building corridor roads and looking at markets than Katrin Kuhlman. So I don't know which road we're going to name after you, but not the one that goes nowhere. We'll do another road. But we thank you. But seriously, one of my concerns about phase 2, when you move into these other areas, if you move too soon before countries are ready to harmonize their policies, whether they be in competition or not, you create pressure and differences. That's one of the reasons why the European Union is under such pressure with Brexit and the United Kingdom now, because you moved ahead in areas where maybe the British government, where the British public wasn't quite ready for the kind of movement they make. So I favor, obviously, moving into phase 2. I do hope it forms a basis for U.S. discussions with some WTO issues, what they work out. But I also caution that we don't want to move too fast. For example, some people talk about a common monetary union, we'll say regionally first, before there are common agreements on global objectives, on inflation, what you're trying to do, and so on. So I'm not 100% in favor of that particular suggestion, and that's all I'm going to say for the moment.
Perfect, thank you, Steve. And thank you also for commenting on Dan's comments. So I invite you all to comment on each other's remarks too.
Yeah, I'll just talk about the criteria, and this is sort of in response to the labor question, but it applies to all the eligibility criteria. From our sort of user's perspective, a challenge is targeting the bad actors, and how do you really narrow that down? And a sort of textbook case of this is Bangladesh, which said lost benefits in 2013. That was very much driven by issues in the apparel sector on labor. We had members who were importing porcelain. And because of some of the rules that Marie mentioned, there was really no overlap between the sectors that we were trying to target in Bangladesh and the sectors that actually lost GSP benefits. And so you've got this sort of there's really no incentives for the government of Bangladesh or the garment manufacturers to take steps to keep GSP if they don't get GSP. And we've heard that repeatedly throughout this sort of, whether it's India or Thailand, there's issues that are being raised, and I don't want to make them sound like they're not legitimate issues. But the folks who end up paying are often in the US, but two, in wholly unrelated sectors. And so, again, when we run our numbers, we actually keep tracking what's sort of coming in from India now. India and Turkey are the two GSP countries whose GSP eligible imports have performed the best over the last 3 months. They haven't gotten any GSP in that time. They're just natural outlets for products coming from China. And so what you've got is you've got actions that were taken for specific reasons. You have American companies that are paying because they're trying to get out of China. But the exporters in India and Turkey are actually doing just fine right now. So you've got this mismatch between what you're hoping to accomplish and who's actually paying, and sometimes that's a country mismatch, but it's also a sector mismatch where you're trying to change practices in one sector in a country, and wholly unrelated sectors are the ones who actually are hit by withdrawing preferences.
Thanks, Dan.
A